organizations need to perform well if they're to provide a good return on investment, if they are to maintain the engagement of their employees and managers, if they're to grow and to expand their capacity, they need to perform well. And so we oftentimes focus on performance, and performance is often said to be the object of strategy. And yet we rarely think about what performance really means. Now, years ago, there was a somewhat famous song by Sean P. Diddy Combs called "It's All About the Benjamins," and I jokingly said to people that performance is as simple as that. But while that's easily said, it's really not especially true, because we don't really know what we mean by the Benjamins. And let me give you an example. Suppose we were to compare two companies, one with sales of $1 billion and with a profit of $50 million. That's a good return. $50 million is an awful lot. Over $1 billion of sales, though, $50 million might seem a good return to some. To others, it might not seem a great return. But suppose we were to compare it to a company that had only $100 million of sales, but that had $10 million in profit. Well, would you rather be the company with $10 million of profit, or would you prefer to be the company with $50 million? Well, certainly $50 million is more than 10. But at the same time, that $50 million came off of $1 billion of sales, whereas the $10 million in profit came off of only $100 million. And so the company with the smaller profit, in this case, the one with $10 million in profit, actually produced a larger return on its activity. The return would be twice the size of the company with the $50 million profit. And this is one of the dilemmas of understanding performance. Performance is difficult to judge outside of its context. Performance is difficult to judge outside of some standard to which we can compare it. And oftentimes that's what investors do. They are comparing the performance of a company to the performance of other companies in which they might invest. And it's part of the dilemma, part of the competitive dynamic that companies face. They have to produce not only a profit, but a profit that looks good in relation to the relative standards that will be applied to them. And this is one of the things that a good strategist, a good strategic manager will understand, is that performance isn't as simple as just making money. Performance is really much more complex than that. And certainly, as we've seen in our world today, customers, investors, suppliers, regulators, community constituents want a company that understands performance in the broadest possible sense, and that doesn't just maximize its profitability, doesn't just make money, but that actually performs well over a variety of dimensions. And so one of the things Andrew and I talk about in the book is the importance of considering performance relative to 3 benchmarks. And those benchmarks are the proper referent group, historical context, and relative to intention. Now, I'll talk about each of those briefly just to explain what I mean. First, the referent group. There are industries that simply produce better profits than other industries. The pharmaceutical industry has historically produced profit margins in the double digits when we compare it to return on sales or return on assets. Historically, that is much, much better than the airline industry, which has produced profits in the single-digit percentage returns, or the grocery store industry, which has also produced returns in the single-digit returns. Certainly, in the age of information technology, firms like Google, firms like Apple, firms like Amazon, produce a much higher profit return, much higher return on sales than companies like Kroger in the grocery store business, or companies like Exxon or BP in the oil and gas industry. And so it's important to compare, when comparing profitability, to compare a company to the appropriate reference. One of the ways we do that is by looking at industry benchmarks. Industry standards are a good reference. They're perhaps not the best reference because, of course, an industry is made up of many different types of companies. But certainly industry is a good place to start. And so when you compare performance, how does it compare to other companies in the industry? How does Delta compare to United, for instance, rather than how does Delta compare to Pfizer? How does Pfizer compare to Merck or AstraZeneca, rather than how does Pfizer compare to Amazon? We want to look for appropriate reference when we evaluate performance. Next of the three we talk about is the importance of comparing performance over time. If a company does poorly in a particular year, say they lose money, how do we decide whether that is an aberration, statistically speaking? Is that something unusual, or is that something that has been ongoing? The company's been losing money for years, and so this year it lost very, very little. Well, that might be seen as an improvement. Whereas a company that made money this year but made less than it did the year before might be seen as a decline. We oftentimes talk about performance in an absolute sense, how much money a company made versus how much money another company made. But what's oftentimes just as important to understand is how much a company made relative to what it did in previous periods. You want to think about performance in terms of the trends over time. Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it staying steady? Given past norms, whether those norms be steady or up and down, how do recent changes compare? Understanding performance in its historical context will add an awful lot as a strategist to your understanding of what the implications are going forward. If a company has lost money several years in a row and this year broke even, that may be a very good indication of good things to come. It may be a very good indication that the strategy is working and that you're on the right track. Whereas if you were to look at just a single year, you might think we're doing the wrong thing because performance is poor. Or a more vexing problem is if performance is good, but only marginally so, and historically performance has been very, very good, well then, even though performance is still marginally good, it could be suggesting a problem on the horizon that we'd need to be aware of. So try to see performance as a function of time and in terms of the curve that it draws over time. Certainly this is something we talk about in the book, and the importance to the strategist is knowing how to interpret that data in the present so that you can plan better in the future. And then the last of the three that I'll talk about is performance relative to expectation. And here again, I'll start with an example. Most of us are familiar with the restaurant chain Chick-fil-A. If you are, you know two things about it are true. Their chicken sandwiches are amazingly tasty, but they are not open to sell those chicken sandwiches on Sunday. All of the stores are closed on Sunday, and thus 1 out of 7 days they are closed and not available to make sales. And that's a lost opportunity for generating revenue. That is a day that they cannot generate sales and generate profits, and that certainly impacts performance. But understanding that that's fundamental to their mission is key to evaluating how important it is. They choose to do this, and so choose to make their money 6 days out of the week so that they can take that 7th day off. Understanding that context is really important to understanding what it is they intend and how to judge their performance relative to that intention. So this is just a brief overview of performance and how it can be more deeply thought about and more deeply understood so that a strategist can make better strategy and understand better the implications of a strategy going forward. Thank you.